My name is Hilda Harris. I am 72 years old, and for nearly 4 decades, I worked as the head nurse at a community hospital in Boston. My hands once held the weight of fragile lives, adjusting IV drips, calming worried families, and carrying the quiet strength that a lifetime of care demands. When my husband passed away, I sold the little home we had built together and moved in with my son Michael and his wife Laura, believing family would mean comfort in my final years. The room they gave me had once been storage. A narrow bed against the wall, shelves lined with towels and cardboard boxes, and a single lamp casting its weak yellow glow. At night, I would sit in that room listening to the muffled hum of the television, below the clink of dishes, the sudden bursts of laughter that never reached my door. I tried to make myself useful. I cooked most dinners, my chicken soup filling the air, while Laura returned late from work. I folded laundry, patched the small tears in Michael's shirts, and guided my granddaughter through spelling words at the kitchen table. Outwardly, I carried dignity, but inside, I felt the sting of being tolerated more than wanted. One evening, as I scrubbed the last plate, I heard Michael's voice float from the living room. He said softly but clearly enough that I could not mistake it. "Mom has become such a burden." That word landed like a stone in my chest. I dried my hands and walked back to my room, each step heavier than the last. Laura had planted the seed earlier. She told me gently that maybe it was time to consider a nursing home, that it would be easier for everyone. I smiled and nodded, because I have always known how to hide pain. Later, in the quiet of my room, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself if dignity always had to be so silent. Each morning, I rose at 5:30 a.m. I brewed coffee, the scent filling the kitchen, and laid out bowls for breakfast before anyone stirred. Those rituals kept me steady, a way to remind myself that I was still needed, even if no one admitted it. Yet the nights always ended the same: footsteps retreating upstairs, the soft glow beneath the living room door, and my own stillness in a space that felt less like home and more like waiting. The days blurred together with an ache I could not name. I carried myself with grace, never asking for more, never letting the sorrow spill into words. But every sound, every glance, every quiet suggestion carved deeper inside me. And it was there in that silence that I began to learn how love can fade into invisibility when those who once leaned on you decide you have become a weight instead of an anchor. Christmas came with the scent of cinnamon and pine, but the warmth was not meant for me. Laura's voice was gentle but final, as she explained that this year would be only for their immediate family. She suggested I visit a friend, as though 72 years of my life could be folded into an afterthought. I nodded and smiled, but inside the words cut deeper than she would ever know. That evening, when the house quieted after the children went upstairs, I opened my small closet and began to fold the few clothes I owned. Each sweater and blouse carried the faint smell of the meals I had cooked, the lives I had tried to stitch together. My hands moved slowly, not from age, but from the weight of choosing to leave. On the desk, I placed a small letter, only a few lines, written in careful handwriting, thanking them for the roof they had given me. I did not accuse, and I did not beg. My words were plain and restrained, the way I had lived under their roof, careful not to disturb. I signed my name and closed the envelope, leaving it where Michael would find it in the morning. The silence of the house pressed against me as I lifted my suitcase and walked to the door. The cold air struck my face when I stepped outside. Snow was falling in thin sheets, each flake catching the dim glow of the street lamps. I pulled my coat tighter and began to walk the wheels of my small suitcase, carving lines into the white surface behind me. Every sound of laughter from the house became fainter as the distance grew. The streets were empty still in the hold of a winter night. My breath rose in clouds, dissolving into the air like unspoken words. The world felt wide and indifferent, yet strangely clean, as though stepping into the cold gave me back the clarity that the house had taken away. My body ached, but my steps did not falter. Behind me, The windows of the house glowed golden with holiday light. Shadows of movement played against the curtains, proof of a family gathered a world I no longer belonged to. I did not look back again. The suitcase rolled forward, the snow muffled every sound, and soon only the image remained. A woman in her 70s, once the steady center of others' lives, walking alone into the night, while the warmth of the home she left behind kept burning without her. The train carried me south through the night, until the streets of Charleston welcomed me with their quiet charm. My suitcase felt lighter as I walked along the brick paths, each step bringing me closer to the place I had kept hidden for so many years. The estate waited at the end of a tree-lined lane, its windows dark and silent beneath the pale morning sky. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The hinges gave a low groan as if the house was waking with me. The air inside was cool, touched with the faint scent of cedar and thyme. When the sunlight streamed across the wide hall, it revealed polished floors, high ceilings, and rooms filled with memories that were mine alone. This house had been left to me by Mrs. Whitaker, a woman I had cared for during her final years at the hospital. She had seen me not just as a nurse, but as a companion, and in her will, she entrusted me with this place. For years, I never spoke of it. I wanted to know if Michael saw me as his mother or as a wallet, if love still had weight without money behind it. Now I knew. I stood in the great room, my hands resting on the back of a chair, and felt something stir inside me. It was not just grief or anger, but a calm determination. I no longer needed to beg for space at someone else's table. I had my own. The house seemed to exhale with me, its walls steady and strong. The days that followed became the beginning of another life. I joined a book club at the local library, my voice timid at first, but soon warmed by laughter among strangers who became friends. At the senior center, I began volunteering, helping others navigate the aches of age, and in doing so, I found healing for my own wounds. In the mornings, I walked through the garden, the winter roses pushing against the cold. Light fell over the fountain, clear and bright, and I let it fall over me too. For the first time in years, I felt whole again. I was no longer the burden in someone else's home. I was Hilda Harris, 72 years old, still capable of starting over. At first, Michael and Laura thought my absence meant freedom. No more quiet figure in the kitchen, no more subtle reminders of responsibility. But within weeks, the comfort they clung to began to unravel. The mortgage company called, questioning payments that had once been steady. Without my steady presence behind the scenes, the cracks in their finances grew wider. The bills piled up on the kitchen counter, envelopes, unopened edges curling. Laura's voice grew sharp, asking Michael why the electricity notice was marked red, why the car payment was late again. Their arguments rose into the night, muffled but bitter, the kind of words that leave wounds. Michael sat with his head in his hands, the weight of debt pressing down harder than he ever expected. The bank moved quickly, its letters clear and cold. Foreclosure loomed, and the house that had once seemed full of promise became a burden too heavy to hold. Michael tried to reason with the lender, tried to stretch the truth about income that never appeared. Laura's anger turned to fear, her whispers about moving in with her parents slicing into his pride. The days grew darker, not just with winter skies, but with the tension of a home crumbling from within. Laura cooked less, the children grew restless, and Michael's silence deepened. The laughter that once filled the living room was replaced by the sharp snap of unpaid notices being torn open and slammed onto the table. One evening near 9 o'clock, Michael finally broke. He picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed my number. He waited the line clicking until a calm voice answered. It was my lawyer. Michael stumbled over his words, begging to speak with me, saying they were drowning, that they needed help. The lawyer's reply was steady, the same words Michael had once thrown at me in my weakest hour. Maybe it is time you figured out your own life. Michael sat frozen, The phone pressed to his ear as the words echoed back at him. His chest tightened with shame, the silence from the other end colder than the winter air outside. He hung up slowly, knowing that the very phrase that had dismissed me was now the one that dismissed him. In the glow of their failing home, Michael and Laura faced what they had never imagined. Without me, their foundation had collapsed. The poetic justice was clear, but I did not gloat. I had no need. Their downfall was their own, and my strength no longer needed to prove itself against their weakness. When Michael finally drove down to Charleston, I already knew he was coming. The sound of tires on gravel echoed through the estate, and I watched from the window as his car rolled to a stop before the iron gates. For a moment, he just sat there staring at the house as if it were some mirage. The mansion stood tall and calm against the afternoon sky, the garden stretching wide with trimmed hedges, and the fountain I had restored only last spring. I could almost feel his disbelief pressing against the air. I opened the door myself. He stood frozen on the steps, his eyes sweeping over the wide porch and polished windows. He looked like a man who had stumbled into someone else's life. Without a word, I led him inside. The smell of wood polish and fresh flowers followed us down the hallway, and his footsteps echoed heavy behind me. I could see him taking it all in: the chandeliers, the high ceilings, the paintings that had belonged to the family I once served as a nurse. I paused at a door near the end of the hall. With one slow push, I let him see the room I'd always kept ready. Inside, the walls were covered with family photographs, birthdays, graduations, summers by the sea, and 100 little moments he had long forgotten. His own face stared back at him from every corner, a boy smiling with cake on his chin, a young man standing proudly beside his father, a son wrapped in my arms. The weight of those memories filled the air until it seemed hard to breathe. Michael stepped closer, his hand trembling as he touched one of the frames. I watched the tears gather in his eyes, the silence breaking something inside him. All the sharp words he had once thrown at me seemed to echo in that room louder now than they had ever sounded in the past. He began to shake, whispering something I could barely hear, words meant to be apologies, but too broken to form clearly. I stayed where I was. My hands rested steady in front of me, my voice unneeded. The photograph spoke louder than I ever could. I let the silence carry its own weight, because this was not a moment for comfort. It was a moment for truth. Finally, Michael lowered himself into the chair by the window, his shoulders heavy as if carrying years of regret. He sat with his face buried in his hands while the afternoon sun poured through the glass. The light fell across my hands, steady and calm as I stood near the window. In that glow, I felt the strength of quiet dignity. For the first time, the power had shifted. He was the one bent by shame, and I was the one standing tall. I sat across from Michael in the quiet of the study, the weight of years between us heavy but not unbearable. His eyes searched mine, full of regret and longing for something he could not name. I knew what he wanted, but I also knew what he needed. I told him I would not hand over money. That part of my life was closed. What I could offer was different. I had a small property on the edge of town, nothing grand, but enough for a family to call home. He and Laura could rent it for a price so small it was more symbolic than real, but it came with conditions. Michael listened, his hands tightening in his lap as I spoke. He would have to work at the community center I funded, giving back to the same kind of people who once gave to us. Laura would have to attend financial counseling, learning the lessons she had never wanted to face. These were not punishments. They were the only way forward if they wanted a life built on respect instead of entitlement. For a long moment he was silent, and I wondered if he would turn away. But then his shoulders fell, and he nodded with a quiet acceptance. He stood, hesitated, and then stepped toward me. When his arms wrapped around me, I felt the tremor of a son humbled, clinging not to wealth, but to the mother he had nearly lost. I did not speak. I simply held him for a breath, then let him go. As he walked out, I followed and stood in the doorway. The afternoon wind brushed against my hair, the garden swaying in the light. A quiet smile rose to my lips, not of triumph, but of peace. Forgiveness had its conditions, but dignity remained mine to keep. And in that moment, hope felt possible again. In the quiet that followed, I realized forgiveness is not about forgetting. It is about setting boundaries that honor dignity while still leaving a door open for change. My story is not only mine. It belongs to every parent who has felt cast aside and every child who has learned too late the true value of love. If you have ever been hurt by the people closest to you, I hope you remember this. You can choose grace without surrendering your worth. Now I want to hear from you. Would you have given your family a second chance or closed that door forever? Share your thoughts in the comments because your voice matters here. And if stories of healing, justice, and resilience speak to you, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next one. Together we keep these lessons alive.